So we're going to start the afternoon off talking about privacy and data protection, an evolving, I lost my notes here. It's an evolving part of our industry. So we're going to start with both a speaker and a panel discussion. So first we're going to have Benjamin Farrar, I hope I pronounced that right, close? All right, who's the Director of Privacy and Data Protection at Kantar. Benjamin advises all of the Kantar companies globally on the rapidly evolving space of privacy and data protection. Then we're going to immediately, following his presentation, I think he told me it won't be no longer than 20 minutes, he promises. We will transition into a panel discussion led by Jim Longo of Discuss.io. Hope I got that right. And on that panel, Benjamin will join that panel along with the illustrious Patrick Comer, who will now get a chance to speak, and Jim Bernier, who, funny little story here, I haven't actually seen him yet, but when I checked in yesterday, oh, there he is, I went to the front desk and I said, so I'm here to check in. They're like, okay, I give my name, Rob Berger, here's my thing. And they're like, well, you already checked in. I'm like, that's not possible. They're like, did you already check in online? I'm like, didn't know you could check in online. And they continue to say, well, you're already here. I'm like, I'm not. I just got here off the plane. And he's like, okay, let me look into it. He looks into it 5 minutes later. I'm like, this is so weird. I think someone stole my identity. He's like, well, the credit card in your room is not your name. It's somebody named Jim Bernier. I'm like, why is he in my room? He's like, well, because your name starts B-E-R and his name starts B-E-R, and whoever was here last night was probably drunk and just skipped ahead and put him in your room. So, Jim, you were in my room at least for one night, unbeknownst to myself, and they gave me a bigger room, though, than you to make up for it. They said, you will have a better room than Jim. So I'm in a double, huge, two king-size beds. I can sleep in either bed, whichever night I want. But it was a kind of a funny little event that when I got here this yesterday afternoon. So without further ado, I want to call up Benjamin to discuss the privacy and data protection.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Okay. I'm going to talk about what I think is a fascinating topic. I will try. I'm not a lawyer, so I will not use the monotone, low language that lawyers are accustomed to. I work with them frequently, so I can impersonate them if needed, but I won't do that today. Okay, so if we're going to start out, I'm going to give you some definitions about privacy and what we're going to talk about here. You might be surprised, privacy is not an easy thing to define. It depends on a number of factors. If you talk to privacy officers or privacy professionals in your company or in any industry, once you come to them for a simple question of what is personal data, can you define it for us, you'll find out they'll ask you a number of questions back. So it's not such an easy thing to define. But for our topic, I wanted to cover at least these 3 points to give you all a better understanding of where we are. So privacy concerns usually develop in any situation where uniquely identifiable information about a person is collected, that data is processed, and that data is stored. So that should resonate with everyone in the room. Privacy refers to the rights and obligations of individuals and organizations with respect to the collection, use of data, retention of data, disclosure of data, and the destruction of either personally identifiable information or individually identifiable information. And commonly you see privacy talked about in the media, and I'm used to hearing these discussions, but they typically talk about 4 different shelves or 4 different realms, and they kind of use them interchangeably. So this will give you kind of an indication, or at least I like to think of it as a library shelf. So individuals will raise concerns about privacy in one of these 4 areas. One, we talked about privacy of personal information, the use of the information. Secondly, it's privacy of personal communications. So this could be not about personal data at all. It's just saying I'm having communications individual to individual or a company, and then they raise privacy concerns and say, you know, red flag on privacy. Another one is privacy of personal behavior. This is what we're calling, observation of what an individual does. So physically observing them, but also digitally observing them. They can raise their hand and say, cry foul for privacy in that regard. And then the last one is privacy of the person. It's about the individual, the integrity of a person's body. So in your physical house or space or your rights, searching my car in the airport, going through security and the images and the physical, searching of a person. So this can be another area of privacy. So if you're not up to date, like I am, I focus on this full-time, which is a great pleasure for me, so for privacy and data protection. Here is a map color-coded with all the countries that have a law about privacy or data protection. Okay? You might have thought it was Canada, US, and a bunch of countries in Europe. So this could be quite a shock or a surprise. The other thing to realize is that these are local laws, but they have global reach. This is amazing in a digital sense because that's not how laws are commonly designed. It's subject to the jurisdiction in which you're in. But yes, a law in Russia can affect you, even if you don't have operations in Russia. But if you're processing data about people there, it is subject to you, and vice versa. So moving on from images, if you'd like a count of countries, it's about 120 countries or jurisdictions that have a law about privacy or data protection. So we're connecting them together. And what do these laws talk about? So if I'm going to give you a whistle-stop tour, if you haven't been familiar or followed it closely over the last 2 years, they can be talking about the obligations of data processors and data controllers. Who fits that role and what are the obligations required underneath them. This is the European Union model. These laws can be talking about cross-border restrictions or movements of data, when that data can be moved, when it cannot be moved, and what are the iterative steps that need to occur before it can be moved. Some of these laws are about data localization, so either from an economic sense, trying to keep data within a country, or for government access to make sure that data resides in the country so that they can access it at any time. These laws can talk about data security and all the requirements that you're supposed to have to secure the data. These laws can be about data retention, how long you're required to keep certain data elements, and then vice versa. It can be about data deletion, when you're required to delete these data elements. In the US, we have breach notification. So I'm saying breach or loss. So one is data, disappearing, not sure where it appeared. It fell off the back of the truck. Breach could be a hacking particular incident, or it could be inadvertent disclosure. In the U.S., we've got 47 states that have a law about breach notification. The 47 laws are different. They have a number of forms which are required. If you lose data for individuals in those states, there's a number of iterative steps, and they don't all follow the same consensus of what you're obligated to do. Some of these laws are talking about notice requirements. This can be language that needs to be included in your privacy policy. This can be disclosures such as cookie notices when cookies are being dropped on websites. Some of them are talking about the element of the choice principle. So what are requirements for opt-out, how that's supposed to be administered, and at the point of data collection, including notices, and what is the choice that individual can exercise. They're also talking about data use commitments as well. So if you obtain data, identify the certain uses you're going to use it for, and then you could be limited if you haven't identified. There could be some secondary use limitations. And we don't all have a crystal ball. We can't predict what our future data use is, but some of these laws are accounting for that, or certainly when they get to regulatory investigation. They can talk about contractual obligations. So a law might not be subject to you directly, or your third parties that you're working with, but the law requires the same control to be extended into them. All right, so also understand there's some carve-outs about these laws and regulations. Some of them relate to public data, private data, and it just depends on the particular country in which you're subject to. I included spam quickly, marketing, commercial communications. This is typically not directly a privacy issue, but a lot of times it falls into the privacy office because the principles that are required in spam legislation, notice and choice and opt-out, are easily understood by privacy professionals. So it kind of makes sense, although it's more of a commercial piece, that privacy officers at least understand it. And children's data, particularly in the US. There's certainly going to be more of this. Even yesterday, President Obama gave a speech at the FTC. It was about consumer protections, but he also mentioned there's going to be reform in education laws there as well. So children's data, not just under 13, if it's collected in an education context, we're talking about middle school, high school, and college as well. So they have protections. So if I'm going to run you through about regulators very quickly, if you're not intimately familiar, over the last 5 years, certainly the last 2 years, let's leave it at this. They have slowly increased their powers of what they're able to do. Sometimes they pass laws, sometimes they're just working things in their legislation to extend their footprint, okay? These are some of the powers that they have that you might not be aware of in certain countries. They can block or ban processing in a country in which you can operate. This can significantly impact your business if you're no longer able to move data out of a country. They can require, if they think it's been collected on inappropriate terms, for you to delete or destroy that data set. Business could evaporate overnight if it's not collected appropriately. Are they looking? Here's a number of audits at the bottom. Other regulators are auditing, but these are the number of audits in 2014. I just had the numbers for the top European countries of audits they did at companies asking about data practices. Okay, at least for these, what I want everyone to understand is that in the US, a single data incident, and I'm not talking about a breach or hack, I'm just talking about any sort of incident, can really affect your organization 4 times. It can hit you in the belt 4 times. So one could be potential class action lawsuit. This has expenses for defense. You may end up settling. You can also get an inquiry from the FTC. If this can be a 1-year or 2-year process of investigation and questions, a significant time of management's attention is required for this. And you could be subject into a consent order, which is an agreement of terms you're going to perform going forward. And they'll also leave you with the gift of you will be audited for the next 20 years by an external auditor, which will share the information with a regulator to make sure they know that you're continuing to operate successfully, meeting the principles. You can get a letter from your congressman asking, we'd like to know more about your data practices. And Attorney Generals can do the same thing. If you're operating, pulling data from individuals in the state, they will send you a letter as well saying, we'd like to know more about your practices. In Europe, it's not quite the 4, rope-a-dope against the wall, but there are very well connected with legislation and sanctions and the courts to be able to do a process, but it's not the same. So the same behavior, business behavior, could get you in trouble in 4 different ways. And it all comes down to this, if I was to try to summarize it in one slide. It is, I call this the identifiability line, and it's where are you on this identifiability line? And it's not as simple as one particular point. It depends on the data set that you have. It depends on combinations of data sets. Combining 2, it could move it to a different point. It could depend on what country you're talking about, US, Europe. PII is a US term, personally identifiable information. Europe says, personal information. These are different things. They're defined completely differently, all the way to, identified and aggregate. So this is important to understand that these points are changing. So we did a study, Lightspeed did a study. I worked with them. If you'd like more specifics from, their capabilities and how they perform this, talk to me afterwards. But we surveyed US, Germany, Mexico, and India. So we asked them a number of questions. I just selected a few. But one is, which of the following would you like to control access to in order to protect your personal information on your mobile device? So this was a mobile, the theme of this survey was mobile data protection, okay? I wanted to put this up because it shows you that, look at these data items, pictures, contact lists, location, surfing history, posts on websites. These all, people wanted to have some control over it and know who was accessing it, okay? And these are panelists. Next one, how concerned are you about your data privacy when using the following devices? Takeaway from this is they saw tablets and PCs as being not as big of a concern. Smartphones, they had much bigger concern. And we had some great quotes. I wanted to pass them. Here's one. The stuff you read in newspaper is enough proof that the current regulations are not good enough, from a female in California. Which of the following entities do you believe collect data about you in the use of their online services or apps and share the information that can identify you by name with other companies? Okay, this is their perspective. Very high numbers. Collect information when you use their services and share it by name. We did include market research. We wanted to see where that would fall on the barometer. These individuals quite certainly can't identify what's a market research company and what isn't, but I wanted to show you that it's in the ecosystem of concerns and have perception. So we potentially have a trust issue. Do you think governments and companies and our companies can access information on your mobile phone without your permission? Amazing, high percentage numbers here. Another quote, "On certain occasions, they say they will only share your information with their commercial partners, but it turns out to be multiple companies or their partners, and shortly you get endless bombardment of advertising." Comment from Mexico. So, do people do these things? Are they just passively? We said, do you delete cookies? Yes. Do you delete messages on your phone? Yes. Browser history? Yes. Have you not shared information with a company that you didn't trust? Yes. Have you restricted permissions on apps? Yes. Have you changed your password? All this was in the last 6 months. High numbers of people doing these behaviors. Do you think current privacy regulations are sufficient to protect your personal information? Look, they're not legal scholars, but amazingly, Germany has some of the strictest data protection laws in the world, and 80% of them said it's still not enough. Here, another quote. "I just hope you people come up with something that's more flexible considering privacy issues of consumers. What I'm trying to point out is that it should not be a matter of black and white. We must have some way to restrict what we want to share and what we do not want. Instead of allowing access to everything or denying access to everything, there must be a middle way out." Now, again, it's a context of mobile privacy and things operating on that ecosystem, but a very interesting comment. Which of the following would you like to be more informed of? I read a lot of studies, and this is a common point of consumers are going to say, I want to know more. I want to know who has my personal data. I'd like to know how you got it, whether you're selling it, what type, how is it being collected. So this is only increasing. In fact, this is the common theme. I see different studies that have different elements, but this is consistent. They all want to know more about it. Now, there's a paradox because occasionally they indicate behaviors that would show the opposite of that, but at least their perception is that they want to know more. So as I mentioned, a number of studies, including some of the entities in this room, are doing some very interesting privacy studies as well. This one, I just wanted to highlight one because this was one called EMC Privacy Index Study. They did 15 countries, and they came up with a lot of things. But one that I really liked was they came up with persons have a persona. So depending on that same person wanting to trade X amount of data elements would be more willing or less willing to do it depending on which of these personas they were operating in. So social is not just social media, but communicating by email or on any sort of communication or with family or friends. They might be obviously willing to share lots of things. Same person in the financial persona transaction, don't want the bank to know as much information. Citizen, government, national security, different elements. So each one of those operating an employer, a consumer, or medical. So it wasn't just one person is comfortable to share certain data elements. It varied depending on this persona. So what are we to do now, right? So, thanks, Ben, for telling me the world is complex and the sky is falling, all right? Appreciate it. Well, I'll give you some points of things that I think are either happening or important to do and to be aware of. One is the market research codes and guidelines. I just selected 2, SMR and Casero. There are others. These are great. You should be very familiar with them. These are not documents in which you can say, yeah, I read that 2 years ago. You need to keep it closer, available, or at least have someone on your staff who is intimately more familiar and can drop down to these certain paragraphs that are relevant. Review that as you're thinking about transactions, and then you have the position and the support and backing of an ethical code of standards. Now, some of the things that are being pressed in privacy, the activities are not illegal. They're just ethically challenging, okay? So the codes and Casero is attempting to try to account for that and saying, well, here's a baseline of a way to go on the straight and narrow. And now they won't describe every particular behavior or every type of business or every data merging that you're going to come up with or be presented with, but it does give you a very excellent baseline standard. So, as I mentioned, we did this survey in Lightspeed. So afterward, we reflected internally with them and said, well, what did you learn? What kind of information did you learn from this survey? So they said, clearly, we need to continue to focus and make sure that we're indicating to individuals how their information is being used, okay? That we need to focus on easy-to-understand communications about privacy, perhaps some educational elements about privacy, so that panelists can understand, and make sure that we're looking closely at our privacy policies and that they're aligned with local and regional practices that are consistent. And they also mentioned to me is to say focus on fair exchange, so value proposition. It gave them a different intake on, well, if people really have sensitivities about certain of these data elements, let's take a look at our value proposition. What are we providing them? Is it enough? Would these individuals complain if we have certain data elements, unless they're being compensated equally or fairly? Maybe they're very willing to do it. So from a crystal ball legal perspective for the future, what are things that I see that are happening in the space? One, a lot of times they'll say, or you'll hear discussions about, well, privacy policies are too long, they're too complex, and they're written by lawyers. Okay? Well, the next step is the mistake would be, let's just slim down our privacy policy to 2 paragraphs and put it out there. Okay? This would also be a detrimental mistake. Because you could think of your privacy policy as your contract with your consumers, okay? So we all know the process that you have to go through for procurement and negotiation about working with third parties and providers, can be a long process, very diligent and due diligence. This privacy policy should be looked at as a contract as well, okay? Because it is enforceable and regulators will look at that. And you can't drop any particular language in there and expect, well, they clicked through, called click wrap. They just clicked and accepted it. Even if you put it in, you can still be found that clause is not fair, and they're not subject to it, and then you're back in some scrutiny for the practice. So what I'm hearing discussions now is that, okay, well, the lawyers are going to continue to write the privacy policy. We're going to continue to look at it every 6 to 12 months. Business is moving fast. Technology is coming on board. We have to include more things to be more transparent about things that are happening. They're all carefully worded. But what about consumers? Perhaps a transparency policy, okay? Something that sits on the side and says, not jokingly, but saying, this is the, a few paragraphs about our business practice that explains about data transactions and sharing. It's enough information that they can read it and get the gist of it. And then if you'd like full disclosures, please see our privacy policy. So I'm seeing more discussions about this model. Next, I've seen discussions about privacy policy symbols. Okay, I can read a privacy policy pretty quickly. It's been done quite a few times, but can we come up with symbols which will convey some of these data transactions a lot faster so that someone can see there's third-party sharing or confidentiality or what's the option of notice or choice? Color code symbols, could it be universally accepted? So I am seeing research and discussions about this, and that makes a lot of sense. Even a long privacy policy with some visuals perhaps can be improved or more readable. Like you to understand that regulators like the stage that they've been presented upon. Okay, so for the last number of years, it's been a developing field, but now they have a big universe to look at. They're talking about things like Internet of Things. They're talking about all sorts of wearable techs. So they're no longer sort of in the back office in a government agency just trying to get some attention. They've been given the grand stage, and they're interested to take a look at it. Mobile is high on their list. They have a real interest in mobile. They have a real interest in Internet of Things, and they're out there being active and speaking about it. Big data analytics, they have a keen interest in this as well. To plant a seed, because it's a very complex topic to go into, but there's this debate that's going to come about harms and benefits. And it is incredibly difficult for a company to talk about its big data analytics process and to be able to say, well, I don't think anyone's going to be harmed in the future by this processing. It's borderline impossible, but regulators are going to be pushing this and saying, well, did you do due diligence? Are you considering whether an individual could be harmed, not by the data set that you directly collected, but by combination of other data elements? They're interested in facial data and facial recognition, and I mentioned the Internet of Things. So I try to do my best to keep up with their agenda, and the regulators are pretty hip nowadays. So anyway, thank you. We had some of the researchers. There was a number of very interesting things that we got from that research, so I wanted to thank them for their contribution. Efren Ribeiro, Ivo Kotzev, and Stefan Krugler, who aren't here today, but they did great for the research. So with that, I think we'll go right into a panel and hopefully have some interesting questions and discussion.
First couple things before we get into the discussion. I know it's after lunch and it's kind of lull, but I'm a local boy. Who dat? But who dat? So that's a statement. That's not a question. If anyone does say that to you, and at breakfast, people were talking about, oh, I'm glad it's in the wintertime. We're here in the summer. It was 150 degrees, and the city smelled. Well, couple comments on that. Number one, we have awesome seafood. How to dispose of that seafood after you eat it, the shells and whatnot, so they have to go somewhere. Apologize for that. Smells like urine and vomit when I'm here. Well, guess what, people? That's not the locals doing that. That's the people who come visit. All right? I'm not saying anybody here. Maybe someone from Alabama, but not anyone here. All right? God, I hope no one's from Alabama here. Roll Tide. Yeah. Anyway, just trying to have some fun here. But privacy. Hats off to the programming committee for putting this front and center right after lunch. Usually this is buried deep in the program, last right before the cocktails. People, they need to know about privacy, but they don't want to talk about it, right? Yeah, it's boring, but, look what just happened with Sony. My goodness. Something like that happening to our industry would crush us, just crush our industry. I mean, it's not a scare tactic, it's real life. It's happening out there, we have to be aware. We use email all the time, sending data back and forth in email. Probably the worst way to transfer information. Going through servers that anyone could pick up on, right? How many people here want to just give out their PIN numbers, right? Because basically if you're sending any kind of private information, it's going across, someone can pick that up. So this is a very serious topic. So again, hats off for putting this front and center. So let's get started. Benjamin, great presentation. I really enjoyed that. I learned a little bit myself. I'm involved in using webcams in all of my interviews, so it's a little bit different than doing surveys. So we're actually, we see people, we see their facial reactions, we actually see their homes. So privacy is very important for us as well. So just to get started, I think each of you should probably give us a little description. We heard from Benjamin, but maybe from Patrick and Jim, about what they think privacy is and how important it is and how relevant it is today especially. And hopefully none of them thought the Sony hack was a PR stunt and POTUS and FBI was all in on it. But basically, it's very important. So we'll start with Patrick. I'm sure you have an opinion.
Well, thanks for doing the presentation. That was great. Looking at privacy, one thing that struck me looking at the end of years, there were about 50 different markets that members of the exchange transacted in 2014. And I recognize there are probably various local, international data and privacy laws at play. And I wonder how many members knew what they all were. Right? So I just look at the complexity of the problem. And the complexity, in my mind, is growing fast because of the technical integrations that are happening between sample players. And so suddenly there's a lot of ability to transact in markets in a very fast fashion. And it sometimes feel like there's been a lot of Wild West feeling about privacy and data. We just sped out to do all this very, very quickly. And then now I think we're taking a question of, well, what does that mean in terms of privacy, in terms of data management? And so that's like the big aha from the year. There's also the scenario where suppliers are passing data back and forth, where the demographic data, status data, all this data about respondents may not be considered PII in quotes from a U.S. perspective. There's a lot of different data, and there are questions about, well, who owns this data? What's the appropriate use of this data? And so those are the two elements that we are suddenly very obviously working in a fast-paced global environment where the privacy and data ramifications are important for us to understand. So on some level, I feel like we're learning the nuance as we're all growing here. That's just.
And from my perspective, I kind of looking at privacy from two different perspectives. One from a business perspective and what we do in the industry, and with that, we understand that consumers are out there and they're giving up that privacy so they can gain access to different content or have improved service and functionality. And we have to make that value exchange. And with that, the trick is the only way you can make that a fair value exchange is to relay to the consumer what exactly is going to happen with that information once it's transferred over. And I think it is incredibly complicated to explain that to someone in that little snippet or even in that giant privacy policy so that they can completely grasp what's going to happen with their data after it leaves their hands. And I know what I can do to control the flow of that information when it comes through my organization, just like you can with your organizations to some degree, right? But what happens to my personal data when I'm sharing that out on the internet or through apps and other interactions that I have? So, over the weekend, I was thinking about this a bit, and I'm watching my 3 young kids all tapping away on their tablets. I see my wife with her wearable, and I'm saying to myself, what kind of mosaic is being painted about all the members of my family? We have background data sets that are public information, combined now with information that's transmitted over the internet through various profiles, whether it's social media or wearables where you're putting in now biometric data. And what's that data going to be used for in, say, 10 years when my oldest daughter is going to be applying for college? What are employers going to be using with that data? What about the insurance companies? Are we going to be restricted access to certain health benefits because they can see based on our exercise behaviors, our caloric intake, other metrics combined with other data? Will that point to you being a risk? So, Benjamin talked a bit about there being, future harms. I'm thinking about that from a personal perspective. So, and you can see I go to great lengths to try to actually preserve my privacy. In fact, I checked in under a different name, and you're splitting hairs here.
Interesting point, Jim. Benjamin, the study that you just presented, was there any difference? Because some people have said that, well, younger people today, those under 30, say, are not concerned about privacy like someone maybe over 40 is. Did you pick up anything on that?
Yeah, I've read a number of studies, and ours did that too. The opinion of that is that it's a bit of a myth. So the younger millennials shouldn't be dismissed. Perhaps they're more informed and can make the decisions easier, quicker. And then other generations would have a reservation about it. But they understand a value exchange of saying, well, I know this service isn't free, so they're using my data. Let me think about what data I have on it. Now, I mean, we can't all make the best decisions that are available about sharing information at a young age. But what I'm getting a sense of is that they're perhaps better informed than other generations, and they understand that there's a trade-off, and they're not just oblivious to it. And some could say there's a potential sort of uprising of young folks in a revolt and saying, I don't like this whole ecosystem at all. It just doesn't seem right with me. And this, again, would be back to a trust issue that would be plaguing wide.
And that falls back on us. I think this is great we're having this conversation, and this goes for all the conversations that we've had so far today. Sometimes I feel like we're preaching to the choir, though, because we all understand the importance of these things and the changing methodologies and using mobile and things like that. But we really do need, and this is an action item I'm just going to throw out there, we talked about it at lunch, is what if we could get more corporate buyers of research and corporate researchers to these conferences? That's great. Clorox is here. There's a couple others. But I personally believe, and I put a challenge out to the associations and SampleCon, that we should offer free admission to corporate researchers to come in and come to a conference so they can hear these topics. Because, for so many years, I've been in this industry 1,000 years, and I tell you, it's the same conversation. We're having the same conversation today about mobile that we had about online research in 2000. What about trackers? What's that going to do to trackers? And, it's like we're talking to ourselves. We have to have the clients in the room. I think that's very important, and that goes with privacy as well. So I put that out there. With automation, okay, my business is built on automation. Sample for you, same thing, Patrick. So tell me, where do we fit privacy into the whole process? How important is it, and where does it fit in, and at what stages should we be telling clients or telling respondents or participants about what we do about privacy?
Well, obviously there's the privacy policy upon registration in a panel. Where it gets confusing for the respondent and where it's still ambiguous, I think, for the players is what happens between a panel registration and being invited to a survey and all the methods and third parties that a respondent can go through before they actually start an actual survey. And we all know that via routing and through third-party sample acquisition, it could be 2, 3, 4, 5 different parties. And so the question is not, in my mind, where's the weak link? It's not in the privacy policy necessarily of the panel or of the survey company, because I think those are pretty well established. But as buyers of sample or sellers of sample, what are the trust factors and guidelines for the entire process? To make sure that if I'm a owner of sample, that I'm not only a bad experience, but exposing some kind of privacy risk to my respondents by having them pass through this process. More often, if I'm also buying sample, am I actually exposing myself to some kind of liability because the respondent has doled out information through a routing or pre-screening process that's not being handled appropriately, or for some reason that data is being used for a non-research purpose, and so suddenly I'm, without knowing it, in breach of certain standards or ethics codes within our industry. So that's the biggest concern I have. Automation just speeds it up, right? Suddenly we have a lot more of it. It's happening a lot faster.
Absolutely.
So I really look at that middle piece. How do we understand what's happening, not just from who the suppliers are, which is the transparency piece we'll talk about later, but what are the methods and how is the data being managed, stored, and protected for both the buyer, seller, and the respondents?
Yeah, I'd agree with that, and it really speaks to the importance of knowing your entire supply chain. And because of that speed, you don't have the chance, you don't have the opportunity to stop and interrogate and evaluate in this particular situation which suppliers should I be working with, which third parties can or should I be handing off to. You need to know that in advance, because otherwise you eliminate the power of automation. And so that's really the challenge for us. And how do we communicate the handoffs you're speaking to, right? Do we need to have? We've been talking about having potentially, some kind of symbol that is recognizable to the end respondent when they're getting passed from stage to stage. What would happen, when they're in a routed environment? Would they just have a strobe light of colors flashing at them as they moved from, step to step? That's going to be a challenge for us. Perhaps. People would need to, combine that with some other kind of clearinghouse method for controlling when and where they can have their information shared and ported over. It's going to be quite complicated for us, and I think we'll solve it, but it's going to take some concerted effort from a lot of people.
Well, I'll offer this comment that automation doesn't give you a free pass on privacy or data protection, just removing a human from it. That's one thing to recognize. Actually, all the way back to the 1970s is when someone was thinking about this, and this is when they developed the FIPS, which is the Fair Information Privacy Practices. So these are kind of bedrock principles, And yes, so why am I citing some advice that someone came up with in the 1970s or multiple individuals? And this was because someone was sitting in a room looking at all these gigantic machines processing information automatically, and they said, we should come up with some rules about the automatic processing of data because we are removed from them and these blinking lights are doing it. And so even they were thinking about that, about the automatic processing of information. So even to this day, here's a cheat sheet that the FIPS are very useful to use as you're looking at different countries because they're generally recognized in all legislation. While they don't directly include the FIPS, you can see elements of it, notice and choice. So privacy professionals talk about these principles, and this is generally what they're talking about. Local countries will enforce them in different order or prioritize them different. So that's the key piece. But you can all find elements of them in their priorities. So automation and data privacy go hand in hand there.
So you mentioned different countries, different laws, different perspective of what privacy means. Where does a market research company go to get all that information? Is there one entity? Does there need to be one? Is that another call to action?
Well,
I mean, I read the SMR guidance, I read the CASRO guidance. I mean, they do a very good job. I read them regularly, and I will push them out in our organization to keep people current. They also have lists of by country. What are some market research considerations? I consult them if someone's coming to me about we're looking to do a project in next country, and I'm not familiar. Ultimately, it does come down to, honestly, legal counsel. These are laws. They're interpreted by lawyers. And if you're looking at a study across 16 countries, and there's a privacy law, but you're not sure if you're going to be totally in line with it, you are taking a chance if you haven't got some legal guidance about operations in that country. So I do think the membership organizations play a role in that, but they could probably offer more input about the direction they're going and the information that they have.
It's about the dialogue and keeping it open. I think that's key.
Well, I think that for years we've looked at quality of supply chain, for example, using the SMR 28 or different methods of looking at supply. I think we're only starting now to include the privacy and data management as a part of that audit, as it were, where we're not just asking about how respondents are being recruited or incentivized, but also starting to ask about, well, what is your, for example, what is your privacy policy? How are you handling data management? Right. And I predict and see more and more companies going through the audit of the entire supply chain just from a privacy policy standpoint or a data management standpoint and starting to say to different suppliers, you need to change things in order for me to buy sample from you now. Because if I can't buy sample of you, I'm going to start taking on liability because you're not actually living up to standards that I need to live by. Same thing happens in the reverse. If I'm selling sample to a party that isn't handling my respondent very well, what are the ways that a supplier needs to audit the buyer to make sure that they're not opening themselves up as well? Not just from again, we have for so long focused on respondent experience and
right.
quality of the sampling and of the research, but now there's this data aspect that is broader than I think we've noticed before.
Yeah, and with the, I agree with everything that's been said, and just beyond that, we need to have a greater awareness of what are all of the handoffs throughout the research process. Where are you getting the respondent from? What are you doing with them? What third parties might get access to them during the survey process itself? What's happening after data collection completes? And in some cases, the challenges are that we're not quite sure if there are issues or not. And so we rely more and more on experts like Benjamin, and for us at GFK, we have folks like that scattered across the globe because the rules are different. And because it's so nuanced, you have to have someone who is an absolute expert in the privacy and data protection in that local area in order to get an effective ruling on it.
I just wonder how smaller companies handle that. I can see GFK or Kantar has the capability of global data privacy management, et cetera. And then a smaller company looks at, I want to do a project in France, can I ask ethnicity, right? How do you, as open question, how do you solve for that challenge without the resources that you guys bring to bear?
It's complicated. There's no shortage of that. I mean, one could look at principles, like I mentioned. I would encourage a dialogue, with, either your privacy officers or designated contacts that can speak to this. I mean, I'm fortunate I can focus on this full time, and I really, really like this space, and it's going to get increasingly complicated. So I would say you have an opportunity to now. It's sort of, I would say the field has moved. When I started in it, they were trying to, in the early 2000s, it was kind of like the young child. It was trying to figure out what it was going to do. What was data privacy, compliance going to be about? And now it's kind of moved into its adolescence, so it's a little bit rowdier, kind of the, rowdy teenager. You don't know, they could go on the, in the straight and narrow, where things could get out of control. But it's not a discipline that has such a long history that someone couldn't focus on it and understand some of the principles that companies need to practice or map them to. And then when it comes down to saying we'll follow those principles, what's different in the Ukraine, or what's different in Mexico? And then at least you'd have more informed piece about, okay, well, Mexico's really focused on notice, like specific language in their privacy policy. They have other elements of the principle, but if we make a misstatement about our practice in Mexico, we can get into trouble. So that's a more common sense approach to look at them, understanding that each have differences, but you're sort of generally processing those 8 principles, and someone could cite to each one and say, this is opt-out, this is choice, this is transfer, and those would be consistent regardless of what country in which you're trying to work in.
Earlier today, IPS was brought up, and we were talking right before we came on about beacons. Any thoughts on those new techniques or newer techniques that are coming out there, or concerns that we should address? Or I'm sure some people in the audience we'll get to questions in just a minute here.
Yeah, so I'll take the first stab at it, which is, I don't know if anyone's actually opened up their conference badge. So in the center of that, you may notice a small chip. And so in a minute, we're going to post a map with, it's a heat map of where everyone was for the last 24 hours. No, just kidding. I did see some concern in the audience. People said,
see, you clicked the terms, you didn't read them.
Yeah, well, beacons offer an interesting opportunity. I mean, I can appreciate it from a research context. There's some traps you can fall into, and some companies have, and I mean, I applaud them for being disruptors and trying to figure it out. But I guess some common sense things is to you can't just collect data because it's echoing from a phone and expect not to get some questions about it. So that's one thing. You can have a model of saying, all right, only people who opt in. So if they've downloaded our app, that's part of, for a retail store, then that's part of the communication, and we'll send some notices so that, they have agreed. Folks that are just sort of in a store and their phones and the beacons are registering back, there's some tension there. And some of the providers have gotten together and they've created a sort of industry saying, well, you can go to our website and you can opt out. Not singly, they said opt out of the whole platform for these 12 companies that are all doing this type of thing. Regulators said that's a good start, but this individual didn't agree for you to receive information about their phone, so they're sort of challenging them there. So there's different positions to operate in beacons, but those are some traps in which one could fall into, and also data retention and aggregate, and I identify the identifiability line. Don't fall in the trap by saying, well, we don't have the person's name, so we should be able to do kind of anything with it. It's identifiable information, and the European law says this law is subject to data about an identifiable person. The only way you might get off of it is if that person is no longer living, then they're not subject to the rule. But just understand that it's not about name, but it's about identifiable person.
Okay, last question from me, but what is the most important steps that we can take to help reduce our liability as an industry?
I'll go first. I mean, I think the biggest thing we can do, I mean, it's been stated time and time again today, it's that lack of trust and confidence. So I just think as a collective group, we need to step it up in terms of getting that information out there and really explaining to the end consumer what's happening with their data, The fact that there are a lot of people in this room that handle data, and we do it to the absolute best we can, and we have people's privacy in mind. It's going to have folks like Benjamin, those compliance folks inside your organizations, or access to someone like Benjamin to be there for a consult before you go to field. I also think it has to do with limiting the data you collect. If you don't need it, don't collect it. So it's collecting just what you need, treating it properly, and then disposing it when you're done. The more we hang on to it, it just increases the risk. And we're talking about these future harms. I mean, I don't know how people are going to figure that out. And then I think the final piece is just for all of our organizations to focus on internal education and making people aware that they don't have to be an expert to this kind of level, but they have to know just enough to raise their hand and say, wait a minute, I'm not sure if we're getting into some gray area. Can I get a ruling? And I think if we all spent more time doing that, we'd probably have drastically reduced our liability.
I came from the financial services industry as they were grappling with privacy and data protection rules that were handed to them. And I came from the healthcare industry at the same time. So as these rules were being handed down and the organization figuring out how we were going to implement these in practice. Two very different organizations, varying in their degree of technology, sophistication, and ability to invest in technology. I would say, and I'm new to market research, but my sense is that it has an opportunity for a period of time to ask these challenging questions and make sure that you can explain the story and that you're very comfortable with data practices, because at any particular point, someone could be called just for inquiry, and it might not be your practice. It could be another provider or someone that you're working with. And if there's a lot of interconnection, you want to be able to say, yes, this is our business. I know it's complicated. I'm happy to explain it to you, and here's how we do it, and here's how we're comfortable with all these particular transactions. So you have an opportunity to get that straight and make sure you can explain it. And if there's not something that's clear, ask some questions now. Otherwise, it could be too late in a few years before there's strict laws requiring some of these things are being pulled into discussions about what's a data broker, is market research similar to data brokers, and a lot of other prickly conversations. But so there's an opportunity here for some length of time.
I keep coming back to the word transparency. And the more we understand the supply chain, or the handoffs, that's a great word there, all the handoffs that happen with data and with respondent information. We do have a moment right now to get it right. I think it's starting to bubble up as one of the things that needs to be considered. I can only imagine that we're going to start buyers and sellers are asking about privacy policy. I just see that coming, and that's so healthy because it's not been at the forefront of the conversation that different parties have had with each other. So I just keep going back to that word transparency as being very important right now.
Yeah, I would agree. Okay, well, turn it over to the floor. Now you're the panel and the experts as well. Do you have questions for us or for anyone in the room that might be able to help? Yeah, yes. Go ahead.
Hey, is it on? There we go. So in market research, we're all about monetizing data and the conclusions that we draw from that data. But at the end of the day, all these data points are still specific people. So Ben, when you were talking about secondary uses in aggregation, when do we need to start being cognizant of those secondary uses and the aggregation that happens in the conclusions that we draw from it? Are we as an industry really going to turn away efficiency and extra revenue because we don't want to protect a specific validated market that we already think we know more about?
What's very important is the exact language in your privacy policy. If you think the language has been sitting on the shelf and it's a bit old and moldy and it's something, a sticker you slapped on at the end, it's what the lawyer did the last week before you went live with your product or your website, your privacy policy is not in the best shape in which it can to fully monetize, or I like to say, making the data more liquid. It's been stamped with those terms. And that's the collection, and if depending on what you've said, and there's been a history that I've seen reading older privacy policies in market research and other companies, but they would say, your data is confidential. We will not share it with anyone, because it was all about giving confidence to participate. And if you still have that tone of voice in your privacy policy and someone's approaching you because you now have a valuable data asset that can then, to make it more liquid, you're a bit limited. So regulators are looking at secondary use, and this is when certain transactions will happen. So it's having someone that's familiar with their privacy policy, and then just being of that frame of mind and saying, is this a secondary use? And then I say, please get us your privacy policies. We'll look at them side by side and make a decisioning based on that. But more recent, more current reviews can help in that certain fashion to make it more available for research and use.
Andy, did you have a question?
Benjamin, you had thrown up in your slides a bullet point on color codes and symbols. I'm a big fan of simplification, often guilty of oversimplification. What is the status? What is the any resistance or acceptance of the color coding and symbols? Because to me, that seems like the easiest thing we could embrace and try to move forward as an industry with. Obviously not taking away legal claims that back it and everything else, but in terms of visually for a consumer to understand what they're giving up and what they're maybe gaining.
Yes, it was some research I've seen done by, I know Trustee was one of the entities that was fostering the research with someone else, and then they had presented these saying, here's color codes, here's symbols, and we're publishing this out for acceptance. People thought it was a great idea. I'm not familiar with history of, I hear it's challenging for universal adoption of symbols, so perhaps someone who's very skilled or has experience in that could take that further, but they've released some information that makes a lot of sense as to whether it's going to get traction and go further. I haven't heard a lot of traction, but I'm one mentioning it and continuing to mention it as well, because I think it's important, and it is one mechanism. But if you'd like to know more about their research, you can connect with me afterward with anyone, and I can at least share that white paper so you get a sense of what it is that they came up with.
Okay, we can take one more question. Anyone?
I just had a question about EFF as a resource. I've been very interested in their fingerprinting paper that they released, I guess, 3 or 4 years ago.
Who was this?
EFF, Electronic Frontier Foundation,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. Yes, I closely watch them. I mean, I have a widespread of organizations that I look, and I like to look at organizations that are, really privacy advocates on one extreme end, ones that are sort of in the middle ground, maybe more of a business consumer, base, by saying we can appreciate concerns about privacy, but we have to, pay our employees and find different ways to make money. And so over time, there's a number of organizations that I follow as they release their papers or research, and EFF is one of them. They're on the side of aligning for rights, strong privacy rights for advocates and challenging companies in their practices. But they do some great research. And another piece that I wanted to share about researchers such as EFF and individuals associated, not always directly with them, but a lot of times they go through the shop of the EFF. Researchers and extreme advocates have the ear of regulators who are very eager and say, we'd like to know how digital advertising is working, and they will go and analyze the traffic that's on the internet in multiple ways, and then present them a report and say, I know you might not understand all the zeros and ones, but you need to investigate this particular activity. So they're hip, they get it, and they also figure out if they don't quite get it, they can quickly find someone who's very interested in helping them figure it out. So it's an increasingly technical space in which regulators have people in their office who can decipher this information for them.
Okay.